Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. In behalf, I'm Khalid Al Hassan, the president of the Saudi Society of Nephrology and Transplantation. On behalf of our or your society, we'd like to welcome all of you actually, and welcome our speaker today and our moderators. As our promise that we're gonna continue our webinars and educational sessions during this pandemics area. So today we have another webinar, and it will be very interesting topics, although it is a rare disease, but unfortunately because of high consanguineous marriage in Saudi Arabia, we have unfortunately increasing number of those type of cases. So I will not take long time, but before we start the webinar, I would like to thank the sponsor company, Taiba Medical Health. So without their support, we cannot continue doing those webinars. So I would like to thank the sponsor company, and I would like to introduce today our moderator, Professor Abdullah Al Harthi, who's a professor of pediatric nephrology in Taif University. Abdullah, mic is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulullah. Now, it gives me a great pleasure to share with you today the webinar, which I am sure all of you will have an interesting topic with an outstanding speaker. And first, I would like to thank the Saudi Society of Nephrology, and a special thank to the President, Dr. Khalid Al Hassan, for inviting me to share in this an excellent session. And now it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Justine Bakita. And Dr. Justine, she's a professor of pediatric hospital, Civil de Lyon University, and she's the head of the pediatric nephrology, rheumatology, and dermatology unit. She's a vice chair of the Department of Pediatric in the Hospital of Mercy Infant Hospital, Civil de Lyon, France. In fact, Dr. Justine, she's a well-known figure in the field of pediatric nephrology. Her main clinical and basic research in the main field of phosphate and calcium metabolism and kidney and bone in chronic kidney diseases. And she's interesting in subject of bone physiology and pathophysiology, and in bone and chronic kidney disease, and in bone diseases in rare renal disease, and in bone diseases in pediatric chronic disease. In fact, she is an active researcher. She has more than 170 publications in peer-reviewed journals with 30 book chapters and 3 books with 2 coordination books. And she's invited in lectures in many national and international conferences with oral communication also, and with many posters and more than 120 abstracts. And she's a co-author in international and national conferences. She's, of course, a member and active member in scientific societies and working groups in national and international societies. And she has many awards and grants regarding her research. I am sure today we'll enjoy the talk with Prof. Justine about very interesting topic, the primary hyperoxaluria from a liver and kidney transplant, which was the only way of success in the treatment of primary hyperoxaluria, to the new RNA interference therapies that I am sure Dr. Justine will give us the hope that we are reaching now regarding the use of RNA therapies in primary hyperoxaluria, not only in type 1, but probably, hopefully, inshallah, in other types, type 2 and 3. So please, Prof. Justine, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Arty, for this very nice introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really my pleasure to give you some new insight in primary hyperoxaluria. Okay. So these are my disclosures, and before discussing these new therapies, I would like to remind you a little bit on primary hyperoxaluria, and I will refer to this primary hyperoxaluria as PH for the rest of the talk. And you know that before discussing primary genetic hyperoxaluria, we may rule out secondary hyperoxaluria. And secondary hyperoxaluria may occur as a result of excess dietary intake, as a result of poisoning with oxalate precursors, intoxication to ascorbic acid, or may occur as a result of enteric hyperoxaluria, for example, after bowel resection, or whether this kind of clinical setting is quite simple, and usually there is no doubt between primary and secondary hyperoxaluria. So we have three different types of pH, type 1, type 2, type 3, that I will define in the coming slides. But just to also remind you that at the moment, some genetic pH are non-1, non-2, non-3, just because at the moment, the underlying defect is not yet known, but probably in the future, we may have some other types. And clinical presentations of pH can be very different. They can begin, and you know that, from the neonatal onset with end-stage renal disease very early in life, within the first months of life, and this is the most severe form of the disease. It's PH1, and as pediatric nephrologists, we don't like this disease at all, because it gives a huge burden, it induces, a huge burden on the child, his or her parents and siblings, and until recently, it was a discussion of double kidney liver transplantation with all the complications you may imagine on the long term. But you also have some less severe forms, even in PH1, with, for example, nephrolithiasis occurring during adulthood. But for the ones who are adult nephrologists or adult urologists, I just would like to remind you a very specific clinical picture that could be the relapse of PH1 on a renal graft in a patient with end-stage renal disease of unknown cause. And in such a case, if you provide the patient with only a kidney transplantation, you will not cure the disease. You will still induce an overproduction of oxalate by the liver, and then your disease will relapse. And it can be, I think, in 2021, a shame not to diagnose this patient. So in case of end-stage renal disease of unknown etiology, especially if you have nephrocalcinosis, or especially if you have consanguinity, it can be very wise to perform a genetic testing to rule out PH1. Okay, so this is a very complicated scheme, and I'm not a biochemist at all, but just to show you that the genetic defect in pH is in the hepatocyte, and more precisely in the peroxisome for the type 1 with a mutation of the AGT. And the type 2, it's a mutation of the cytosolic GRHPR. And the type 3 that was described more recently corresponds to a defect in a mitochondrial enzyme. And all this defect leads to increased oxalate levels. And you know that oxalate is not soluble, thus inducing nephrolithiasis. So there is something to know in terms of epidemiology, is the difference between the estimated and the expected prevalence of PH. And in fact, from clinical studies, we usually say that the prevalence is 3 per 1 million persons. And when you look into genomic studies, you should expect 1 pH per 60,000 people. So basically, there is, you can see a kind of difference, and we may imagine that some patients are not diagnosed. And in fact, in the Oxal Europe registry, we have around 1,300 patients, and we could expect almost 9,000 patients in this registry for Europe. And we know that we have 84% of PH1 patients, 8% of PH2, and 8% of PH3, as you can see on this schema. And in fact, from the genomic studies, we should expect rather almost 50% of PH3, 30% of PH1, and 20% of PH2. And what this schema means that we are probably under-diagnosing PH3 patients. They are for sure the less severe forms of PH, but still, I think we can improve, all of us can improve, and 80% of patients, at least in Europe, are currently probably not diagnosed, and we have a true underdiagnosis of PH3. So, if we go back to this table summarizing the different types, if we go into the clinical details, so type 1 is the most severe form with a risk of end-stage renal disease in almost 100% of cases. Usually, you have increased oxalate and glycolate levels in the urine, and you know that in these patients, we should propose combined or sequential liver kidney transplantation. In type 2, you can see that type 2 and type 3 can begin at all ages, even during infancy and early childhood. Type 2 will induce a risk of end-stage renal disease of 25%, with 50% of patients with chronic kidney disease. And usually it has been discussed that glycerate can be increased, but I think one of the main messages is that among all these biomarkers, there is no real specificity, neither for glycolate, glycerate, or OG, and you cannot provide a subtype of a pH only with biochemicals. You need to perform genetic analysis. And in type 2, usually you will perform only isolated kidney transplants. In type 3, that is known to be the less severe form, you have exceptionally end-stage renal disease, but up to 50% of patients may present with chronic kidney disease, and you have also some increase of oxalate and glycolate. So I put a few slides on PH1. You already know that it's a very severe renal disease. And if we go back to this paper published in 2012, coming from the European ESPN ERA-EDTA registry, that evaluated almost 10,000 children below 19 years of age, beginning renal replacement therapy between 1979 and 2009 in 31 European countries. Among these 10,000 patients, 100 of them had a PH. And you can see that the survival, the patient survival with PH was significantly decreased as compared to patients with end-stage renal disease, but without PH. And more interestingly, you can see that we improve over time, and patients reaching end-stage renal disease after 2000 have a far better prognosis than patients in the past. So this is, I think, a good point. And again, and this is really important for the discussion we will have soon on the new therapies, the mortality of these patients is driven mainly by the complications of liver transplantation. Also, from the same paper, to show you that in case of PH1, before the emergence of new therapies, this disease requires for sure liver kidney transplantation. And you can see again the graft survival in non-PH patients, in PH patients receiving combined or sequential liver kidney transplant, and the poor graft survival in patients receiving only kidney transplantation. And the main message, but you all know that, is that you should not perform isolated kidney transplant in case of PH1. Also, coming back in 2010, some data showing a genotype-phenotype correlation with the European mutation, the GLI170 arginine, that is B6 sensitive, by the way, and showing that this mutation has a better prognosis in terms of age of onset of end-stage renal disease. In terms of PH2, we usually say that it's less severe than PH1, and it's true, but still it's not completely benign either. And this paper is a little bit more recent. It was published by Sanders Garrelf in Amsterdam in Kidney in 2019. Data from the Oxal-Europe registry, including 101 patients from 11 countries with a genetic diagnosis of PH2, with a median follow-up of 12 years. That is very good for a registry. And you can see that the median ages at first symptoms and diagnosis were 3.2 and 8 years respectively, meaning that you have almost 5 years between the first symptom and the diagnosis, showing a huge delay in the diagnosis of this orphan disease. And in the setting of the new therapies, we should all work to decrease this time to diagnosis. And in this cohort of PH2 patients, urolithiasis was the most common symptom in more than 80% of cases. And you can see that nephrocalcinosis and recurrent urinary tract infections were seen in 30 to 35% of patients. And I think this is a very interesting result from this study, showing that when you perform the oxalate over creatinine ratio on a spot urine analysis, what we usually do as pediatric nephrologists, because it's simpler and it's easier for parents and for the child, 10% of these spot analysis were negative despite a genetic confirmed PH2. And in case of 24-hour urine collection, this number falls at 4%, meaning that if the child is old enough to perform a 24-hour urine collection, in case of clinical doubt of pH, you should perform a 24-hour urine collection. And on top of that, you may have a huge intra-individual variation of 24-hour oxalate expression by almost 30%. So I think it's important, and this is a point that can be complicated and challenging when you perform clinical trials in the field. Another slide on the prognosis of PH2, and Sanders compared the patients with PH2 in red on this figure and the renal survival as compared to different subtypes of PH1 with different mutations, as you can see there. And you can see that the prognosis of PH2 patients is better than PH1 patients. And I forgot to tell you that in PH1, almost 200 mutations have been described. And in PH2, there are more than 30 different described mutations. And in this cohort of 101 patients with PH2, no genotype-phenotype correlation was seen, maybe because of a lack of power of the study. And last, there is one slide on PH2 showing that it can be severe, since 22% of patients reach CKD stage 5, 4 patients presented with systemic oxalosis, and the median renal survival was 43 years, meaning that they reach end-stage renal disease quite early in adulthood. And last but not least, and I present these data that are not on PubMed yet, but I think they should be on PubMed very soon. And they were published by Cristina Martini-Guerras in Kidney on behalf of Oxal Europe, evaluating 95 patients with a genetic confirmation of PH3. And you can see that even if we say that PH3 is not severe, the median age at first symptoms was 1.9 years, with a median age at diagnosis, again, similarly to PH3, delayed at 6.3 years of age. And urolithiasis was a major symptom observed in 70% of pediatric patients, as you can see on this schema, but also some patients, and especially the youngest, may also present with nephrocalcinosis and or UTI. And again, and I think this message, I already told you that at least twice, but the biochemical profile was comparable between PH1, PH2, and PH3 in terms of urinary oxalate, So you cannot distinguish between these 3 types based on urinary oxalate. Just a small precision, a small detail, patients with PH1 who were B6 sensitive had a significant decrease urinary oxalate as compared to the other groups. And in terms of renal prognosis, so obviously it's better than PH1 and PH2, but still you can see on the timeline at 20 years of age, some patients already display CKD 2 to 3, and then you have 1 older patient with CKD 4, 5. And at last follow-up, eGFR in this cohort of PH3, 21% of patients had CKD stage 2 or more. So it's not so benign. So this was what I wanted to say on the different PH1, 2, and 3. And now I will focus on PH1, its diagnosis and its management. So in terms of diagnosis, I think that with this schema, you have all the signs, the red flags that should warn you that it may be PH1. So in case of recurrent lithiasis, and especially in case of bilateral lithiasis, in case of nephrocalcinosis, in case of progressive kidney function decline that could progress to end-stage renal disease, in case of kidney stone, especially in a child, in case of failure to thrive in infancy, and in case of family history of stones, you should rule out PH, and especially if you have consanguinity, as you nicely said during the introduction of the talk. So how can you do the diagnosis? First thing, and I strongly recommend you to refer to this paper published by Pierre Cochat and Jill Ransby in the New England in 2013, you have reference data for spot urine for oxalate over creatinine, glycolate creatinine, glycerate creatinine, depending on age, and you also have reference values for 24-hour urine oxalate and glycolate. And in case of normal renal function, you may measure in the urine oxalate and creatinine. You may also measure the other markers, but the two most important, are oxalate and creatinine. When renal function is normal, there is no need to measure circulating oxalate, because circulating oxalate will be normal. And I think this is really important because sometimes physicians are confused, only measure oxalate in blood, it's normal, and they say it's not pH and it can be pH. You may measure oxalate and creatinine in the plasma only in case of impaired renal function, especially when GFR is below 45 mL per minute per 1.73 square meters. And as already said, in case of suspicion of pH, you may perform the genetic analysis to confirm it and to type your pH. And just a reminder, because PH1 is not only a renal disease or not only a liver renal disease, it's also a systemic disease. And you know that very well that from stage 4 to 5, and especially in dialysis, you will have a progressive systemic oxalosis with deposits of oxalate in the kidney, but also in bone, in the heart, in the tissues, in the vessels, inducing this severe systemic form of PH1. And this is really important. And in the European guidelines published in NDT in 2012, you have a table detailing all these organs and this systemic involvement with the symptoms you may search for and the diagnostic tools you may use. But we will discuss that a little bit later because it's one of my main topic of interest. But bone is the main compartment for oxalate storage, and bone disease is really important and really impairs the quality of life of these patients. Apart from CKD and BD, you have a specific bone impairment that can induce a lot of problems in dialysis and after transplantation. So now we will discuss a bit the management of PH1. So before discussing the new therapies, I thought it was important to remind you the conventional management of PH1. And then you have the first non-specific measure is the hyperhydration, and we say at least 3 liters per square meter per day. And you know, when you are a pediatric nephrologist, but sometimes it's very challenging and that you may need a G-tube for nocturnal hydration with a significant burden of the child and the family. Usually we say that for PH1, there is no need for a specific diet. You do not need to avoid food very rich in oxalate. Because usually the main source of oxalate in PH1 is endogenous, and intestinal oxalate absorption is lower in PH patients as compared to normal subjects. Obviously, you may perform the diet for CKD. In terms of medications, you may provide alkalinization with potassium citrate and sometimes sodium bicarbonate or both, but usually it's preferred to provide potassium citrate. And you may try to test the sensitivity to vitamin B6, to pyridoxine, and you will begin using a dose of 5 milligrams per kilo per day, and you will progressively increase up to 20 milligrams per kilo per day. And usually in the guidelines, they say to try it for at least 3 months, and you would consider a responsiveness if urinary oxalate decreases by at least 30%. And I put you there the 3 main mutations that are usually B6 sensitive. Obviously, if you're a patient, if you are sure of compliance, and if your patient does not decrease urinary oxalate with B6, you can stop it. And then in terms of surgery, in terms of surgical management of lithiasis and complications, the priority should be given to mini invasive endoscopic procedures to avoid to be too traumatic on these kidneys. And last but not least, obviously, sometimes you need to perform dialysis in these patients, even though it is suggested to consider preemptive transplantation in PH1 patients with progressive CKD. It's sometimes completely impossible in clinical practice. And in such a case, we usually perform short and frequent hemodialysis sessions, 5 to 6 sessions per week. And I will detail that a little bit later in the talk. So this is a paper, again, published from the French experience in 27 children with PH1 on conservative therapy with a median follow-up of almost 9 years. And during this follow-up, 20 patients had a stable GFR with hyperhydration, B6 if responsiveness, and alkalinization. And the only variable significantly associated with the deterioration of renal function was a therapeutic delay with a relative risk of 1.7 per year without treatment. But obviously, you can see that it's not ideal because some patients decrease their GFR, reach end-stage renal disease, and it's only a palliative management. So we are focusing now on the present or the future, but I think the present of the management of genetic PH. And this is in fact this concept of RNA interfering therapies that was developed by these people who got the Nobel in 2006 to try to block specifically some enzyme of in these metabolic pathways to overcome these genetic defects and to decrease the hepatic production of oxalate. And you know that in 2020, briefly, you could provide the conventional management. In case of early diagnosis of PH1, you may propose an isolated liver transplant. In case of end-stage renal disease, it would be a double combined or sequential liver kidney transplantation. And you know that some teams prefer the combined, some teams prefer the sequential, but there is no evidence for one on another strategy. But with this kind of strategies, you will induce lifelong immunosuppression with a significant risk of tumoral and infectious complications and a significant mortality risk induced by the liver transplantation. And then in case of combined kidney liver transplantation, you have a specific and challenging post-transplantation management with a long-term hyperhydration, with citrate, with patients who can display fractures. So it's not an easy way for the patient. And then some robust experimental data were published in 2017 by Libo in the JASN in the murine model of PH1. And you can see that with these RNA interfering therapies, you could nicely decrease urinary oxalate and in the same time increase urinary glycolate, because this is the mode of action with an inhibition of the glycolate oxidase. So you decrease the production of oxalate, but you increase the production of glycolate. And in 2017, it was the murine model. And in November 2020, the lumasiran was approved in Europe and in the US for PH1. So this is a very busy schema. And again, I'm not a biochemist, but basically when you inhibit the glycolate oxidase, that is the enzyme that is upstream the AGT, you will decrease this oxalate production, and this is proposed in PH1 patients, and this is the lumasiran, and we will discuss the clinical results in the coming slides. There is another way that is currently evaluated is to target the phenyl pathway and to inhibit the LDH. And this is, in such a case, you may propose it to patients with PH1, 2, and 3. And it's also RNA interfering therapy that is called nedosiran. And there are some clinical trials ongoing, and we may have results soon, but it could be interesting for PH2 and PH3 patients also. So just the proof of concept, because I told you that with the inhibition of the glycolate oxidase, you will decrease oxalate, but you will increase glycolate. And glycolate is thought to be non-toxic, but still it remains to be proved. And MacGregor published last year a very nice observation of patient of a healthy adult woman who underwent a sequencing of autozygous human populations as part of the study. And they found in this woman a complete knockout of the glycolate oxidase, and she has no clinical phenotype. She's doing perfectly well. And when you take a look to her labs, you can see that a plasma glycolate is 12 times the upper normal limit. And the urinary glycolate is 7 times the upper normal limit. And she's doing perfectly well. So this is the proof of concept that you may inhibit the glycolate oxidase to treat PH1. And still, this RNA interfering lumasiran was approved, and it targets directly the hepatic glycolate oxidase, as you can see on this scheme. So a couple of days ago, the New England Journal of Medicine released this original paper, and I think you have seen it, demonstrating the interest of lumasiran for PH1 patients. And this is the Illuminate-A study, results at 6 months, and it was a randomized placebo-controlled trial, meaning that 26 patients received lumasiran and 13 received placebo. And these patients were above 6 years of age with an eGFR above 30 mL per minute per 1.73 square meters, with urinary oxalate on 24-hour urine collection above 0.70 millimole per day at inclusion. And the primary endpoint was the percentage of reduction of urinary oxalate. And in this paper, only the data at 6 months are presented. And what we can see from this data is that you can see nicely that in the placebo group, in terms of urinary oxalate expressed as a % change from baseline or as an absolute value, you can see that there is no change in the placebo group. And in the lumasiran group, you have a significant and a very nice decrease of oxalate, of urinary oxalate, In the same time, you can also see a significant decrease of plasma oxalate with lumasiran. I forgot to tell you that in this Illuminate-A study, patients still undergo hyperhydration and alkalinization without any changes during the first 12 months. In terms of safety, no differences between groups. Some injection site reactions, as it's usually described in for biotherapies that we inject subcutaneously, but nothing relevant. And then you can see no differences for eGFR at 6 months, but it's very early, of course, and we may imagine that if we go on placebo for a longer time, we may imagine a degradation of renal function with placebo and a stabilization with lumasiran, but still at 6 months, no differences and no safety issue. And then, so these data are not in the New England, but I think they are much more interesting because they go up to 12 months of follow-up. And you can see these patients in purple as the placebo group, and after 6 months, they were switched to lumasiran. And you can see that they also decreased their urinary oxalate, whilst the patients who received during all the study lumasiran remained with nicely corrected urinary oxalate, and there is no rebound, first thing. Second thing, it's another way to present things. You can see that during the double-blind period, so at 6 months, in the lumasiran group, 84% of patients achieved near normalization or normalization of 24-hour urinary oxalate expression at month 6, and at month 12, at 1 year, you have 88% of patients who are within this target. And for the placebo group, who was treated for 6 months with lumasiran after the 6-month period of placebo, 77% of patients reach also this target. So these are very promising results. And I just want to give you a small insight on the Illuminate B study. That was a phase 3 single-arm open-label study in young children less than 6 years of age with an eGFR above 45 milliliters per minute per 1.73 square meters at inclusion, or in children less than 12 months with a normal creatinine at baseline. And you see that 18 patients received lumasiran. There was no placebo group, and you can see the individual data per patient depending on their age. And you can see nicely a significant reduction in urinary oxalate over creatinine ratio based on spot, because in this age group, it's obviously not possible to perform 24-hour urine collection, but also very promising data even in the youngest patients. Okay, so where are we now in France? So the drug is approved, and we use it in PH1 patients in pre-dialysis or in dialysis. And so I went on the European Medical Agency website to have the EPAR information, just saying that depending on the volume and the dose you will provide, for single injection, you may not, the maximum volume per site injection is 1.5 milliliters, and you must be aware of that, especially in adults, obviously. And I'm sorry, because it's in French, I do not have in English, but I will just detail you this table. It's the dose of lumasiran depending on the body weight of the patients, below 10, between 10 and 20 kilograms, and above 20 kilograms. And in the youngest patients, because of the pharmacokinetics of liver pharmacokinetics, you should perform monthly injections of lumasiran until the child reaches 10 kilograms. So you have a loading dose of 6 milligrams per kilo per month, and then the maintenance dose of 3 milligrams per kilo per month. Then when the child is above 10 kilograms, you have the loading period with 1 monthly infusion of 6 milligrams per kilo in if the patient's weighs between 10 and 20 kilograms, and of 3 milligrams per kilo if the patient's weighs above 20 kilograms. And after the 3 injections, you have then injections of 6 or 3 milligrams per kilo every 3 months. So basically, we come from a patient with a double combined kidney liver transplantation to 3 monthly subcutaneous injection of lumasiran. So you can see that there is a kind of a revolution for these patients. And if I present you data in real life data, so most of our patients were included in the industry-sponsored trial. So basically, I cannot discuss them with you. But we have currently 3 patients treated post-approval in Lyon. And the first patient is interesting. It's a girl. She's 6 years of age with an eGFR 74, presenting with multiple lithiasis and UTIs since she's 1 year of age. And then we decided to treat her, and you can see that she had a G-tube with a nocturnal hydration of 1,300 mL plus 1,200 mL per day of water. She had potassium citrate, and she had hydrochlorothiazide and B6. When we B6, but she was not responsive to B6, but it's something we maintain in the hope that it could add something, but without, to be honest, without completely following the guidelines. So still at baseline, we decided to stop B6, and you can see that oxalate over creatinine ratio was quite increased, and the urinary oxalate was also quite increased. And then you have a significant decrease over time, and in the same time, as opposed to the clinical studies, we began to decrease hyperhydration. We stopped hydrochlorothiazide. So basically, we are in the phase when we can progressively decrease conventional management, and she's doing pretty well. The second and third patients are siblings, and the first one is a girl with an infantile severe PH1 diagnosed at the stage of end-stage renal disease within the first 6 months of life. So basically, she's on dialysis, obviously, and she's treated with lumasiran in dialysis, and we are waiting to transplant her with only a kidney and not a kidney and liver transplant. And at the time of diagnosis, the mother was ongoing a new pregnancy. So we proposed the parents to perform a prenatal genetic testing that showed that the fetus was also PH1. And we decided to perform the first cutaneous injection of lumasiran at day 9 of life, once we had the genetic confirmation postnatally in emergency. And obviously, we also began hyperhydration and potassium citrate and everything. And we used the protocol with 6 milligrams per kilo every month for 3 months, and then a subsequent tapering to 3 milligrams per kilo per month. And we had a significant, at the beginning, decrease of oxalate over creatinine ratio in the urine, but we saw nephrocalcinosis stage 3 appearing at 3 months of life. So we wonder whether we should increase again the dose of lumasiran and stay at 6 milligrams per kilo, since we had a nice response at 6 milligrams per kilo in a child that is less than 5 kilograms. So it's very new, and basically it's probably the youngest patient in the world ever treated by lumasiran, and it's very preliminary data, but it's food for thought, and maybe you will have questions on that. So I think there is a question that remains completely open, and that obviously interests me a lot, is the evolution of systemic oxalosis in view of these new therapies. And I will try to give you a bone perspective at that time. So I really like these pictures published last year. It's like a garden of crystals, and you can see these oxalate crystals everywhere in the biopsy. And we know that bone can store massive amounts of oxalate, and patients often present with recurrent low trauma fractures, bone deformities, and severe bone pain with a major impact on their quality of life. And we have shown that the calcium oxalate deposits accumulate not in the bone matrix itself, but in the bone marrow space, with a granulomatous reaction around this deposition with granulomas. And you can see on electronic microscopy this deposit of oxalate. And what we showed is that when we perform some microspectroscopy, that in the bone without crystals, you have exactly the same bone in controls than in patients with PH1, but we had some more brittle bone, so a propensity to fracture. And when we analyzed the bone marrow, we clearly see these oxalate deposits. And these have some direct consequences, and you know that these patients have an increased risk of cytopenias and of anemia, especially with resistance to EPO, and sometimes we have to perform some blood transfusions in PH1 patients with the risk of anti-HLA antibodies that can hamper the prognosis of the graft. And also in adults, it's not uncommon to make a diagnosis of PH1 in adults with unexplained end-stage renal disease who present a severe anemia, who have a bone marrow examination that answers oxalate deposits. And obviously, we have with this bone disease kind of a vicious circle in hemodialysis. And if you remember, the endogenous liver production of oxalate is 4 to 7 millimole per day. And what you can do with dialysis, even if you use high flux, even if you use intensified dialysis protocols, even if you use sometimes a combination of hemo and PD, what we did a few years ago, but we do not do anymore because we have the feeling that with PD, we do not add much clearance, but we add a lot of complications and we add a lot of burden to the family. But still with hemo, you can remove only 1 to 2 millimole per day in adults and 3 to 4 in children, but it's far below the endogenous liver production. So overall, with a standard hemo program, you are not able to clear your oxalate, and you completely worsen your bone disease and your systemic oxalosis in dialysis. So even intensive hemo regimens remove far less oxalate that is endogenously produced, and the frequency of dialysis sessions is much more important than the duration of each session. And the intensive dialysis strategies rely on 6 to 7 sessions per week of 2 to 3 hours. But in such a case, and it's even more important in the youngest children with the infantile form of PH1, you have an additional risk of hypophosphatemia and then of further mineralization defects. And in the youngest kids we add in hemo with PH1, we treat hypophosphatemia by giving phosphate supplementation during the entire session to avoid mineralization defect, additional mineralization defects on top of the bone oxalosis. And I think it's important. CKD-MBD is kind of my passion in life, and I think it's really important in this patient to be very active and proactive to control CKD-MBD parameters, acidosis, PTH, 25D, phosphate, to provide the best as possible, mineral environment for these patients. One question is the interest of bisphosphonates in these patients, and I wondered whether I should keep this slide or not, but still this question is so often asked in clinical practice, and there is so much evidence on PubMed. You can see that we have many references to justify our position and our statement, but my usual answer is to increase epuration, and increase epuration to increase the epuration of oxalate. But I know that this answer is not always satisfactory because patients present multiple fractures even after transplantation, but I do believe that there is a significant risk of secondary low turnover with bone and vascular consequences with bisphosphonates. And if you do that in patients with PH1 with already bone and vascular disease, it will be not good on the long term for them. But I think that the most important thing to keep in mind is that bone epuration of oxalate takes time, and sometimes months and even years after combined transplantation, and even in children who did not wait that much on the waiting list, and we published that a couple of years ago. And so now with these new therapeutic strategies, what will we observe with bone disease and with systemic oxalosis? So we know that systemic oxalosis begins when GFR falls below 45 mL per minute. We know that systemic oxalosis worsens with end-stage renal disease. We know that new therapies should decrease the proportion of patients with end-stage renal disease, at least it's what we hope, but patients will still be diagnosed at end-stage renal disease. Some patients will still need renal replacement therapy, but they may receive RNA interfering therapies in dialysis, thus cancelling the exogenous production of oxalate and thus increasing the removal from bone. So we may expect a decreased incidence of bone impairment due to PH1. We may expect less severe bone phenotypes, but I think we should not expect a complete disappearance of bone impairment. But if the speed of bone oxalate release is increased, maybe we should expect a transient phase of increased bone fragility. And I put a lot of question tags because basically nobody has the answer yet, but I really look forward to seeing the results of the clinical trials in dialysis to try to answer this question, but still I think we should keep this question in mind. And I will finish the last part of my talk eventually is to discuss the other therapeutic perspectives we have in 2021 in the field of PH. So the first thing is the use of Oxalobacter formigenes to try to modulate intestinal absorption of oxalate. And this was the first paper published by Byrne Hope in Pediatric Nephrology in 2017 in children with PH1, 2, and 3, older than 2 years. And the primary endpoint was the reduction in urinary oxalate. And basically, the results were negative, and the authors discussed that probably urinary oxalate was not the good marker, and that in these kind of studies, probably plasma oxalate would be much more interesting to assess. And indeed, Byrne Hope published last year in NDT a study in PH1 patients on maintenance EMO with Oxalobacter formigenes, and basically you can see that as compared to the historical cohort, you see a significant decrease of oxalate levels with Oxalobacter formigenes. So it may be a tool to help, and there are some other clinical trials ongoing in the field. Another possibility is the inhibition of LDH, not with the RNA interference as done with the nedosiran, but with the stiripentol, that is a drug that is approved for Dravet syndrome. So Dravet syndrome, if you don't remember, is a neurological condition with a very specific pediatric kind of epilepsy. And it was published in the JCI 2 years ago that patients with Dravet syndrome had a significant decrease in urinary oxalate over creatinine levels. And then you have some experimental data in hepatocytes showing that when you treat hepatocytes with stiripentol or with silencing RNA that is currently used in experimental models, you can decrease the expression of oxalate. And proof of concept in one patient with PH1. You provide stiripentol, and then you decrease urinary oxalate. It's obviously only one patient, and there are some clinical trials ongoing, but stiripentol may be useful if proven to be true, may be useful for PH1, PH2, and PH3, and probably in developing countries where probably RNA interfering therapies may be hard to obtain, it could be a tool in the future. And as pediatric nephrologists, in the JCI, they also proposed a model of ethylene glycol intoxication that induce oxalosis, acute oxalosis, and it worked very well on the murine model to treat these animals with ethylene glycol and stiripentol, and you can correct acidosis and prevent renal insufficiency. Last possibility is the gene therapy using CRISPR-Cas9 technology, for example, and it was published 2 years ago that you are able to modulate on PH1 iPSC lines, but still it's not completely ready for clinical use yet. So, as a conclusion, I would say that in the 80s and in the 90s, PH1 was a very, very severe disease. And you can see these deposits, you can see this bone disease, you can see these deposits in the eyes, and you can see clearly this severe bone and extra and tissular calcifications. You have like the main milestones in the field with the description of the disease in 1927, the type 1 in 1986, the type 2 in 1999, the type 3 in 2010, and then the RNA interference in 2021, and coming soon, the new European guidelines on diagnosis and management of PH1, integrating all this data, and we are doing that on behalf of Oxal Europe and ERCNet, and I hope that we will be able to submit them soon. So probably we are facing a new revolution, and it's in French, and I'm really sorry for that, but basically what they say is that the interfering RNAs are the new monoclonal antibodies of the 21st century, and probably at least in these indications of PH1, we may completely, dramatically improve the quality of life and the prognosis of our patients. So I would like to thank you, all of you, for your attention, the Saudi Society of Nephrology for inviting me giving this talk, all the people who work in Oxal Europe, we are Rare BCare, and all the people working with me daily, and especially Anne-Laure Cellier-Leclerc, who works a lot with PH patients, and obviously my mentor and expert in the field, Pierre Cochat. Thank you so much, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Prof. Justine, for this excellent and outstanding, clear and informative lecture. Now we will take a few questions, but if you allow me, I will start with myself.
Go ahead.
I will have to
Go ahead.
take the opportunity. I think you mentioned nicely about lumasiran. Then there is also about the other drug, the hepatic LDHA inhibition by nedosiran. Do you have an idea about its use, because it can affect the whole three types? It's the end of the of the schedule, so the oxalate production will be affected. What is your comment about that?
I think we are. It will be interesting to see the clinical data, because we have clinical trials ongoing, and it's true that it will be at least in the clinical trials, it has been proposed in pH 1, 2, and 3. In Lyon, we had patients in the two main industry trials, but basically we were not able to include patients with pH 3 or pH 2 at the moment, so I do not have personal experience. And since we do not have the data of the clinical trials yet, I cannot comment more on that. But it's true that with the inhibition of LDH, whatever the type of inhibition, whether it is RNA interfering therapy or whether it is stiripentol, because I think that stiripentol may be very useful too, and especially since I told you in developing countries, yes, it can be useful for the three types of pH, at least theoretically. But I think the results will be out soon.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll start with the questions from the attendee. And the first question, they said, with your experience, what is the outcome and prognosis in primary hyperoxaluria type 1 post-combined transplant, probably? Any comments?
Yeah, I think the problem is that the quality of life of this patient is quite awful, and you will provide a combined or sequential liver kidney transplantation. Then you have the specific post-transplant management with hyperhydration, with alkalinization, with the risk of fractures. So after transplant, the patient should have the conventional management of hyperoxaluria and all the burden of immunosuppression and the follow-up of the graft, at least during the first months or years of post-transplant. So it works, and I think in Lyon, we have probably between 20 and 25 patients who received during childhood a combined kidney liver transplantation, and globally they are doing pretty well, but the quality of life and the burden of the disease is quite important. I don't know whether I answer the question, but really, I think that we can do it with combined kidney liver, no doubt, but it's difficult, it's challenging, and it's also that has also a huge impact on the quality of life of the patient.
Okay, thank you. There is another question from Abdulaziz. He said, as we know, the kids metabolize drugs differently from adults. How can we find the required dose for each patient? Is it fixed dose or depend on urine oxalate?
This is a very good question. So I'm sorry, I had to speak a little bit quickly because I had too many things to tell. But I will just, because maybe you didn't have time to. But there is this schema, and in fact, it takes into account the different pharmacokinetics in the different age groups, and especially the increased hepatic clearance in the youngest children, because you can see this is for lumasiran. For nedosiran, I think it will be every month, but with lumasiran in the older patients, you can see that after the loading dose, you have a maintenance dose every 3 months. And in the youngest children, there is a monthly dose. And this is the first way to answer the question. And the second way is, I think this question is really relevant. And in the patient we treated from day 9, we did the 6 milligram per kilo and then 3 times, and then we decreased to 3 milligram per kilo. And he was less than 5 kilograms at that time. He was very young, and we had the feeling that urinary oxalate was not controlled enough with 3 milligrams per kilo. You see what I mean? So we will probably in the future maybe try to increase up to 6 milligrams per kilo if we do not have a satisfactory control at the next follow-up. But again, this is this is our experience, and it's quite recent. So there is a space and room for progression and improvement.
Thank you. Dr. Ghassan, probably they are asking about the availability and the cost of RNA therapies.
This is also a very good question, but I feel probably not really at ease to answer, because I think it depends on the countries. And
Yes.
First thing, yeah. So I do not have any idea of how much it can cost in your countries. In Europe, the price will depend on the country, but we may expect at least in France, it would be at least, I think, between 100 and 150,000 euros per year per patient, but it's in France, and it may be more expensive in some countries.
Okay.
And to end this point, the negotiation of price, from what I know, in France is not finished, and it's not between doctors, and it's between directly the companies and the health ministry and the drug agency. So we do not have any control on that. So the system is a little, yes, it's the question is in fact interesting, because probably all patients will not be able to be treated with this kind of drugs. That's why I was insisting on stiripentol, because stiripentol is not expensive.
Absolutely.
If it works, it's yeah.
Yeah. Now this is from Vlebor Tasik, probably. Is lumasiran indicated in children with who are sensitive to pyridoxine? Probably he means. I don't think there is a relation, but.
Thank you, Vlebor, for the question. I think we need to define more precisely the indication, and I hope that with the guidelines we are working on, we are able in the future to answer. I think that B6 sensitivity is not a contraindication to RNA interfering therapy, especially if you do not control correctly the evolution of the disease, and if you do not completely control urinary oxalate. You can treat patients with B6 and RNA interfering therapies.
Now, there are many questions here about the effectiveness of hemodialysis versus CRRT versus peritoneal dialysis and primary hyperoxaluria. What is your recommendation?
Yeah, again, I didn't want to, I couldn't expand on all the topics. PD is not very efficient to remove oxalate. CRRT, I think you cannot provide it on the long term, so it's not a chronic dialysis modality. And hemodialysis is a modality that will remove more oxalate, but you need to provide frequent and short sessions, because when the clearance of oxalate occurs during the first hours of dialysis. So you may provide sessions every day of 2 to 3 hours instead of 4 hours 3 times per week, for sure. And there is also the question of combining PD and hemo, and it's something we did in Lyon in the past. But as I told you, the burden for the family and the child is too important, and I think the benefit in terms of oxalate epuration is not good enough, so we stopped doing that, and now we provide only daily hemodiafiltration.
There's a question, can we combine pyridoxine with stiripentol?
No, there is no slide. Stiripentol is I don't think that it's compared to Stiripentol is not compared to B6. Stiripentol in this cellular model is compared to, let's say, an equivalent of RNA interfering therapy. It's a cellular model directly in hepatocytes. It's not in patients. It's the technology that it's called silencing RNA. I think it's something we use in culture and in cellular culture to inhibit the expression of a specific RNA. And in such a case, this cRNA was designed to inhibit the LDH in the hepatocytes. But it's an experimental model, it's not a clinical model.
Thank you. There is question, is there any well-known contraindication for the use of lumasiran, especially in patients with liver impairment or high liver enzyme?
It's true that in the information sheet from the European agency, it's stated that in case of hepatic impairment, probably you should not use lumasiran, but in the same time, PH1 is not a disease inducing liver disease. You know what I mean? It's a liver disease because it's a metabolic liver disease, but usually your hepatic workup is completely normal in PH1. So it should not be, I think, a problem. But it's true that in case of increased cytolysis marker, you should probably postpone the lumasiran. But we have not seen that in daily practice yet.
Mm-hmm. For the new drug, the nedosiran that inhibits the LDHA, is there any effect, although he said it is mainly inhibition of the liver enzyme, but is there any effect on the long term on the muscles because it will inhibit the LDH?
Again, we do not have data published yet. Okay. So I cannot answer this question. It's a very good question because LDH is not only in the liver, and I 100% agree, but there are no data yet. I think they will come out soon, but I cannot comment more on that because I'm not a co-author of the paper.
Probably we'll give you only the last question, so we'll give you a break on that. Here there is, I can combine the question probably. The side effect of the lumasiran, you said mainly is local, but the systemic, any reported systemic side effects that warrant its use?
I'm not aware of that. At least in the New England, there was nothing, and but I'm not aware of severe side effects.
Okay.
We will try to formally evaluate the French practice soon with all the cases treated in France because it's more than 30 patients at the moment, but we do not have the results yet. So maybe in the coming months, I may have some more detailed answers to this question.
Thank you, Prof. Justine. I think time is to give the mic to Prof. Ahmed or Dr. Khalid. Anyone?
Thank you very much for both of you. I would like also to extend our thanks to our attendees. So I will disclose that we have almost 2,000 attendees to this webinar, and mainly from the Gulf region. So also I will extend the thanks to our sponsor company, the Taiba Medical Health. So thank you very much, Professor Justin Bakita, and hopefully we'll have in the future another collaborations and give another talks, probably a longer follow-up of those type of patients who receive these medications. So thank you very much, and just to remind our colleagues that still we're gonna have more webinars in Ramadan, inshallah. So on 28th of April, 16th of Ramadan, we're gonna have another webinar, inshallah, and we'll send you the posters and the registrations about it. So see you and have a nice night. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Justin.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.